All right. Good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining us. I'm Jonathan Ostis with the Minnesota Department of Agriculture's Plant Protection Division. I am the Emerald Ash Borer Technical Assistance Coordinator for the state. And so we're going to go through kind of general overview of Emerald Ash Borer. And we're having this meeting due to the recent detections of EAB in Kanabec County and then new parts of Cass and Isanti counties. So at any time, if you have questions, please feel free to put them into the chat. You can put it in the chat or the Q&A. I have my colleague, Chris Mallett, that will be helping answer those. And we are recording this meeting, so we will make that link available on our main Emerald Ash Borer webpage in the next day or so. So if you know anybody that wasn't able to attend that would benefit from this information, please just direct them to our website where they'll be able to find a viewing link in the next day or two. With that, I'm going to get started. So if you have any technical difficulties or anything like that, please put that into the chat, and hopefully Chris can help you address those issues, and we'll get started. So our agenda for this meeting is we're going to go over the life cycle of the insect, the host trees, so the trees that are impacted by this insect, how to recognize emerald ash borer, how to find it earlier, so the signs and symptoms that you're going to see first when emerald ash borer begins infesting an ash tree, the distribution of the insect, so where it's known to be throughout the state, where we have confirmed it. And then we'll touch on the regulations associated with emerald ash borer, how you deal with it. So management in terms of dealing with yard trees and community trees. I do have resources for you if you're managing it at kind of that forest stand level. So that is a little bit different than, say, individual tree management. And then lastly, we'll cover the best way to report new sightings of emerald ash borer. So once you learn how to identify it, we really urge you to report possible new infestations as you may see them around the state. All right. So just a little bit of background on the insect. Emerald ash borer is a metallic wood-boring beetle. Its native range is kind of northeastern Asia, so it originates from northern China, parts of Mongolia, the Russian Far East, Japan, the Korean Peninsula, and Taiwan. That's where its native range is, and so it likely showed up in North America sometime in the early to mid 90s. So it first showed up in the Detroit, Michigan, and Windsor, Ontario areas, and was likely brought in via solid wood packaging material to the ports there. And so it got established in that area in the early to mid 90s, and then it went undetected until 2002 when it was finally identified. And at that point, there were thousands of dead and dying ash trees throughout that area. And so lots of infested firewood and ash nursery stock had been moved to other parts of the country, kind of kicking off that rapid spread throughout North America. So now we find emerald ash borer in at least 37 states in 5 Canadian provinces. So it's throughout a good chunk of North America where we have native ash populations. So it was first found in Minnesota in 2009 in the South St. Anthony Park neighborhood of St. Paul. And from there, we've now found it in 47 counties, with Kanabec being the newest one. So the life cycle of this insect. So emerald ash borer adult beetles are actively flying around what we call the EAB active period. So excuse me as I switch back and forth between using the word emerald ash borer or the acronym EAB. I'm going to use it interchangeably throughout this presentation. But the adult beetles are active throughout the summer months. So they typically begin emerging in late May or early June, kind of depending where you're at in Minnesota from north to south and how quickly things warm up in the spring. So our adult flight period we consider it from May through September to account for that, being a large state that has variable weather compared from the south to the north. So the adult beetles begin emerging. They do a little bit of maturation feeding in the canopy of the tree. So they feed on the leaves for a week or two before they then go and find a mate. And so that feeding on the leaves that they do is not something that you notice with the naked eye. It's not going to be an obvious sign or anything that you'll be able to detect. So they do that maturation feeding. They go find a mate. Once they mate, those female beetles begin laying their eggs in the bark cracks and crevices, starting in the mid to upper canopy of a tree and working their way down. So emerald ash borer starts in the top part of the tree and works its way down, because if they started on the trunk of the tree, they would kill their host a lot faster and not use up all the available food that's there for them. So once they begin laying eggs, those eggs hatch within a week or two. And the average emerald ash borer female beetle lays between 60 and 90 eggs. I believe it's about 70 on average, but they can lay upwards of several hundred eggs overall. So once those eggs hatch, those larvae burrow through the bark, and then they begin feeding in that cambium layer. So this is where the insect does the damage to the tree. The larvae feed in that cambium layer, so kind of between that sapwood and the bark, and that's where the tree transports water and nutrients between the root system and the crown. So it basically starts cutting off the circulation of nutrients between that root system and crown. And once enough emerald ash borer is built up in a tree, that's how it girdles and kills the tree. So the larvae then go through what we call larval instars, and that's just growing stages. And so they have 4 larval instars before they then chew a pupal chamber, as you can see in that center picture there with that larva folded in half. They chew that pupal chamber about a 1/4 inch into the wood, or in really large ash trees with thick bark, they'll do that into the bark as well. From there, they're done tunneling and doing damage to the tree, and they're ready to pupate, turn into the adult beetle, emerge from the tree, and start the process all over again. So in Minnesota, we have a 1-year and a 2-year life cycle, and that depends on kind of the density of the infestation in an individual tree and when that egg was laid during the growing season. So the further north you go, the more emerald ash borer you have in that 2-year life cycle. And so to give you an example of a 2-year life cycle, an emerald ash borer egg that was laid in the summer of 2023, it hatched. Its larva started to tunnel underneath the bark there in that cambium layer. It made it partway through its larval development. It then went dormant. It's dormant right now for the winter of 2024. This next spring and summer, it will begin tunneling again, completing its larval development and make its way to its pupal chamber. It'll overwinter a second time, and then in the spring, summer of 2025, will emerge as an adult beetle. So you can really have any immature larval stage under the bark at any time of year, which is important when you think about things like firewood and when that gets moved, and stuff being able to harbor for over a year after it was cut. All right, so I briefly touched on this, but how emerald ash borer kills a tree, it's really the number of them that build up in the tree. So a tree can defend itself from a few insect attacks, but really, as more and more eggs get laid on that tree and you have more larvae tunneling, it ends up basically girdling the tree and cutting off the transport of nutrients between the root system and the crown, and killing the tree. So you go from a few emerald ash borer in that year 1 of infestation to thousands of emerald ash borer in an individual tree by year 4 or 5, and you get this kind of rapid tree mortality. And so the real issue with emerald ash borer is kind of this infestation curve. So it's what we call the death curve. Emerald ash borer populations grow slowly at first, but as they start to build up, you get this exponential growth. And then once that population explodes, within a couple of years of that population explosion, you start to have high tree mortality within a very short amount of time. So if you manage trees in a community, you end up having a lot of trees die in an amount of time where you don't have the resources to deal with all the hazard trees that are around the community. So intervening and beginning management as early as possible in that infestation curve is really important to trying to slow that spread and the rate at which trees die, because starting to do management early on in that infestation is going to have a much bigger impact than if you start later on when there's a lot of emerald ash borer already flying around and you're starting to reach that high mortality rate. So this is really the big issue when it comes to emerald ash borer. A lot of times you'll find it in a community, then within a couple of years you really start to see it everywhere. And then 5 years after it was detected, you have a lot of trees dead within a short amount of time. So emerald ash borer, typically what we see in at least the southern half of communities in the southern half of the state, is that, in 12 to 14 years, it worked its way completely through a community and kills most of the ash trees. So pretty much any ash tree that hasn't been treated with insecticide. All right, so the host trees for this insect. It's all true ash, so anything in the Fraxinus species. And we have three types of native ash. Ash trees have opposite branching, they have compound leaves, and they have 5 to many leaflets, depending on whether it's a green, white, or black ash. And so you can kind of see this diamond ridge bark. Yeah, once you start, if you know how to identify ash trees, or once you learn, you'll see that they are pretty much everywhere. Minnesota has about 1 billion ash trees, so we really do have a huge ash resource. We have more ash than any of the other states in the lower 48. Typically in communities, it's about 1 in 5 trees is an ash tree. And then you get into parts of certain communities in northern Minnesota, and then in western Minnesota, oftentimes it's 1 out of every 3 or 1 out of every 2 trees is a planted ash tree. So it really makes up a huge component of our community forests, and it's a massive resource, and it's going to have a big impact. So if you don't know if you have emerald ash borer yet, you should be planning for it and beginning to take steps to implement a management plan and reduce your ash resource and diversify your community forest. So just to kind of show you the range of where the host trees are. So we have black ash throughout 2/3 of the state. That's where a big bulk of our ash resource is. As speaking in forest terms, we have large swaths of black ash forest in north central and northeastern Minnesota. And then we have green ash that's prevalent throughout the entire state. This is the most common tree that's planted in yards and boulevards and right-of-ways and windrows and things like that. Then we have pockets of white ash that are natural in the more upland areas and pockets of the eastern part of the state. And it's also a pretty common boulevard or landscape tree. And as you can see, they're all highly susceptible. So, once emerald ash borers in an area, it's not a matter of if, but when it will succumb to it. So unless you decide to protect that individual tree with insecticide, which I'll touch on later on in this presentation. I will just mention there is a secondary host. It's called the white fringe tree. It's an ornamental shrub that you see sometimes planted in yards in Minnesota. It's not native to Minnesota, so you won't find any natural populations, but they do sell them at nurseries and whatnot, and emerald ash borer can complete its life cycle within the white fringe tree. It's not a preferred host, but it can complete its life cycle in it. So if you're looking for a new ornamental shrub to plant in your yard or a landscape area, we advise just not to pick a white fringe tree. All right, so how to recognize an emerald ash borer. So the diagnostic identification of the insect. So there's 4 main ways. Really, the number 1 way that we identify emerald ash borer is by finding that S-shaped feeding gallery. So the tunneling that they make in that cambium layer on the surface of the wood is very distinct. If you find those S-shaped tunneling galleries in an ash tree, you know it's emerald ash borer. And so as you can see in that picture in the top left, they have that nice S back and forth shape. If you can find that S curve back and forth in that insect gallery in an ash, you know it's emerald ash borer. It's the only insect that'll do that. We have other insects that'll do that in birch trees and poplar trees, but if it's in an ash, it's emerald ash borer. Next is to the right is the emerald ash borer larva itself. So what's distinct about this is that at the tail end of the larva, there's 2 spine-like projections. So you can see that circled in red. They're called the urogophy, but they're 2 little black pincers that stick out of the tail end of the larva. So if you find an insect larva in an ash tree that you've cut down, if it has 2 of those spine-like projections, you know it's emerald ash borer if you pulled it out of an ash tree. There's a number of insects that you may find in an ash tree that have 1 of those or none of them. But if it has 2, you know you have emerald ash borer. That's all you got to remember. Next is the adult beetle itself. They're about a 1/2 inch long by about an 1/8 inch wide. They have those bright iridescent green wing covers and that kind of deep red magenta colored abdomen. They're very kind of pretty looking insect. It's in the jewel beetle family. So, people do come across them, especially as pest pressure and populations get really high in an area. But typically they're up in the canopy of the tree, and you're not going to come into contact with them usually in the early stages of infestation. It does happen, but it's not that common. They're usually kind of up out of eyesight up in the canopy of the tree. And then next is they leave a specific D-shaped exit hole when they exit the tree. So it's the shape of their head and body that they leave as a hole when they exit the tree. That flat side is either going to be on the top or the bottom. I will say D-shaped exit holes are probably the worst thing to look for, because if you can see those small 1/8-inch wide holes at eye level, if you were to look up into the tree, you should see a lot more damage that would tell you that that tree is infested. And especially on really large mature trees with thick bark, looking for a hole that size along the trunk of the tree is kind of a fool's errand. We also have other native insects that leave oval-shaped holes or more roundish holes. Really, if you think you found a D-shaped exit hole that might be emerald ash borer, you're better off, if you have permission, digging with a pocket knife underneath that bark to look for that S-shaped feeding gallery underneath. So look for the S-shaped feeding galleries, the adult beetles, the larvae. Spend much less time on D-shaped exit holes. And so here's just kind of a list of insects that are often confused with emerald ash borer. So we get reports every year from people that thinking they found emerald ash borer, but it happens to be one of our native insects. So you can see in that upper left corner, we have emerald ash borer itself circled there. But if you scan down to the bottom right corner, the one that we most often get reported that gets confused with emerald ash borer is the 6-spotted tiger beetle. So it's bright iridescent green, and in May and June, oftentimes people will see that run across the sidewalk, their driveway, their deck. It's a ground nesting beetle. It's it kind of sticks out, and people tend to confuse that one with it. So it's got a different body shape, but it can be confused often with it. So keep that in mind when you think you might have found an emerald ash borer. All right, so up next is signs and symptoms. So this is what you want to look for if you want to try to find emerald ash borer as early as possible impacting your ash trees. We really depend on woodpecker feeding damage to kind of clue us into where emerald ash borer is in an area. So woodpeckers love to feed on insect larvae underneath the bark of trees. And so they tend to leave a very distinct look when they're going after emerald ash borer in an ash tree. So like I mentioned before, emerald ash borer starts in the upper canopy of a tree and works its way down. So typically they're going to begin infesting branches between 2 to 6 inches in diameter on that southwest facing side of the tree. So the side of the tree that gets the most amount of direct sunlight. And then oftentimes what you'll see is that woodpeckers will flake off some of that outer bark and leave what we call bark blonding. And within those blonded areas, you're going to see these small dime-sized oval-shaped shallow woodpeck holes that are just going deep enough to get to the insect larva underneath the bark. So we have, they'll go after other types of insects in trees as well. But oftentimes some of our native wood borers will be deeper into the wood. So the woodpeckers will have to go deeper into the wood to get them, and it leaves more of a shadow. And it leaves a different type of look. So you're really looking for these, like I said, dime size, light colored, oval shaped, like shallow woodpeck holes. And it should begin in the mid to upper canopy of a tree. So you're going to see it up there first before you see it further down on the trunk. So a good rule of thumb is that if you only see woodpecker damage on the trunk of an ash tree and nothing up in the canopy on the branches, that's a good sign that it's not emerald ash borer, because you should have it in both locations if what you're seeing is emerald ash borer. So here's some more examples of woodpecker damage. You can just see some of that bark flecked off, creating that blonde appearance that should catch your attention, creating that color contrast, and then those little shallow woodpecks in those blonded areas. The picture in the center is of a black ash, so that doesn't tend to stick out quite as well just due to the coloration of the bark, but it still does leave the same kind of marks. If you look on the right, that's a heavily infested green ash tree in a park. And, as it becomes more heavily infested, you'll see woodpecker damage all the way down to the base of the tree where that bark is. You'll see piles of wood chips around the base, and that bark is starting to fall off. Next up for a symptom to look for are bark splits. So a tree will try to heal around that initial feeding wound when emerald ash borer first starts attacking the tree. And so they'll kind of cordon off that wound and start building callus tissue around where that insect feeding gallery was. And as that tree continues to grow, the bark will detach from the surface of the wood where that feeding gallery is and create a nice vertical split, and where you can often see that S-shaped feeding gallery on the surface of the wood in between that bark split. So here's two examples. One's more obvious than the other, but they can look both ways. And then here's a couple more examples of what you might see, where you can see all along the main stem on that left side picture, you can see those long vertical splits. And then if you look at this picture on the right, you can see some splitting in the center, but if you look up to the top center of the image, you can actually see part of a split with part of that S-shaped feeding gallery in the middle there. So it's kind of discrete. These aren't very obvious when you first start looking for them. But as you see more of it, you can kind of really clue in on where that damage is. And then next is canopy thinning. So unfortunately, with emerald ash borer, it's a very cryptic insect, so you're really not starting to see signs of damage until it's been in the tree for a couple years. Canopy thinning typically begins to become more obvious after you may start to see that woodpecker feeding damage. So, but what you might see is this real thinning of the canopy. So fewer leaves, smaller leaves, a lot more light penetrating through the canopy. Especially this picture on the right, where you get that really thin canopy on the outside. It's not just dead branches, one dead branch in the crown. It's an overall thinning. But then you get a lot of epicormic sprouting, those sucker sprouts along the main stem and the lower part of the canopy, creating this real thin on the outside and these bushy sprouting on the inside along the main stem. That's kind of a stereotypical look of what an ash tree looks like at year 3 or year 4 of infestation. And if you were to look at that tree with once the leaves have dropped, you would be able to see woodpecker damage and bark splits. And so here is the symptom progression of how it generally goes. So this is on average. This can go faster or it can go a little bit slower. It can go faster, especially once an area becomes really heavily infested and you have really high insect pressure. Trees can die, in 3 or 4 years as opposed to 5 or 6. But on average, what we see is that it takes about 5 years from initial infestation to that tree to be completely dead. And so in that first year of infestation, you're not going to see any signs or symptoms on that tree that would let you know that that tree is infested. In that second year of infestation, you have more emerald ash borer building up in that tree. You may have some woodpecking possible that if you really know what you're looking for and you're paying close attention, you might spot it in that second year. In that second year, if it was an otherwise healthy tree, there's likely no real canopy impacts that you would notice that would let you know there was something wrong with that tree. And then as you get into year 3, once again, there's more emerald ash borer building up in that tree. That's when you're really likely to see woodpecker damage and those bark splits. If you know what to look for, you should be able to catch it in that year 3. And oftentimes that canopy, if it was an otherwise healthy tree before it was starting to be attacked by emerald ash borer, would still have a healthy enough canopy to be treated with insecticide. But really, a lot of homeowners start to notice that something is wrong with their tree in that kind of year 4, where you really start to see those visible canopy impacts. You have a lot of woodpecker damage building up in the canopy of the tree and maybe coming down onto the trunk of the tree at that point. And then you really only have a year or 2 before that tree is completely dead and on its way out. So really, from the time when you start to see symptoms to when that tree is dead is only a couple of years. So it's good to be proactive. It's important to note that emerald ash trees become very brittle and hazardous quickly after they die. They dry out quite quickly. So if you have a tree located in an area where it can fall and damage persons or property, you really don't want to wait until that tree is completely dead to deal with it. You want to deal with it before it's completely dead. If it's in, right next to your house in your backyard, if you wait till it's completely dead, it's going to cost a lot more to have that tree removed than it would have if you would have dealt with it before it was completely dead. So it's really be proactive and try not to wait until those trees are completely dead and hazardous, because they do fall apart very quickly within a couple of years after they die. It's not like elm trees that you see on the landscape that have been dead for a decade or 2 that are still standing straight up. Ash trees fall apart and they dry out, and The wood decay fungi associated with the emerald ash borer galleries make it dry out that much quicker, and it becomes very hazardous. All right, so distribution, where it's known to be in Minnesota. So here's our emerald ash borer status map. So this is, you can find the link on our website. If you look at the top of the image, there's our URL right there. Please check on this map frequently, as it does change from day to day as we find new infestations, and new infestations are reported to us. We try to keep it as up to date as possible, as quick as possible. So if you think you know where emerald ash borer might be and it's not represented on this map, please let us know. Just to explain a little bit more about this. So as you can see, we have the quarantine boundaries. So the regulations associated with emerald ash borer that limits the movement of ash material and firewood. Those are the quarantine boundaries in red. And then most importantly is what we have on there is the generally infested areas. So that's that green polygon layer. And so we put a couple mile buffer around confirmed infested tree points to help better represent what might be going on in an area. So like I mentioned, that it takes a couple years to see signs of damage in an ash tree. You know, the average spread rate of the insect without human assisted movement is, about 1 to 2 miles a year. So it's always further beyond what you can physically see as far in terms of symptomatic trees. So we have this kind of expanding buffer around confirmed infested tree points. So if you're within a generally infested area, the best way to think about that is that your tree is very likely already being infested by emerald ash borer, whether it's showing signs of infestation or not, and you should be actively coming up with how you're going to manage or deal with it. So whether that be the eventual removal or treatment, or if it's in a natural setting, you can just let it die and fall apart. But that's the best way to think about that. So if you're within those green polygon areas, you should be active now on dealing and beginning to manage emerald ash borer. Just zooming in a little bit, you can see like confirmed infested tree points show up. So we don't enter every point onto a map. So that's, again, why we have that generally infested area to kind of better represent what's going on. We just try to represent the range of where stuff has been found. And so you can see we have new infestations that keep on popping up. So we have recent finds in Malacca last September in the southern part of Mille Lacs County, the new find in Kanabec in the town of Quamba, right along Highway 23. Recent finds in Little Falls and the town of Genola, just south of Piers there. And then the expansion of the find up in Cass County. So it was originally found along Highway 6, just south of Reamer there. And then we found it a few infested trees in the town of Hackensack. And so that's kind of the recent finds in the area. We're going to keep finding it in new locations. It's, we're now reaching year 15 since it was originally found in St. Paul, and there's been a lot of time for the insect to move naturally and with human assisted movement of, people taking down trees in their yard and bringing it to other places. So expect this map to continue expanding. There will be more announcements in the weeks to come of new detections around the state. So check back frequently with these maps. Just to zoom a little bit more, you can see that find. It's about 7 miles to the northeast of the town of Mora for the town of Quamba, where it's found in Kanabec County. Was recently found just north of Dalbo in northern Isanti County and in the southern part of Cambridge. We just picked it up in Rush City in the northern end of Chisago County. And so you can see a lot of these places are starting to fill in, and it's often found right along main transportation corridors. All right, and then zooming in, like I mentioned, the new finds in Cass County, located in Hackensack and up along the Big Wild Rice Lake there along Highway 6. And so now I'm going to briefly touch on regulations. Unfortunately, our regulatory specialist, Danielle DeVito, was not able to join us today. So if you have specific questions concerning your business that deals with some of these regulated articles, I'll have her contact information for you to reach out to her, and she can address those specific situations. So just in general, we have quarantine boundaries to help reduce or eliminate the spread of the pest through human-assisted movement. And so we really what it's meant to do is restrict that pest movement while facilitating trade so that business can continue to operate and function normally. And so we have two types of quarantines currently for emerald ash borer in the state. We have an internal quarantine and an external quarantine. So the internal quarantine limits the movement of ash, emerald ash borer, firewood between uninfested counties and infested counties. And so we also have an external quarantine that restricts the movement of those regulated articles from out of state or from Canada. So firewood or ash products just can't be brought in from Canada or North Dakota, Wisconsin, unless they have some sort of compliance agreement with the state to allow that, to certify that it's not going to potentially move emerald ash borer to a new location. So like I was mentioning, the regulated articles that fall under the quarantine restrictions are any ash material, so anything Fraxinus species, any emerald ash borer life stage, and then mulch, and all hardwood firewood. So it's all hardwood firewood because the average person can't tell the species of wood in a cut pile of firewood. And so those are all the items that are restricted to move from quarantine areas to non-quarantine areas. So just to kind of visually look at what type of material that is, the ash logs, cut firewood, mulch piles. The mulch will often have large enough pieces of wood that you could potentially have emerald ash borer larval life stages within them, and they don't necessarily always get heated to enough to kill anything that's in it. And so here's a way to think about movement in the state. Apologize for the map not being completely updated, but it gets the point across. So red means stop. You can't go from a quarantine area to a non-quarantine area with any of those articles. You can't go from out of state into Minnesota with any of those articles. And yeah, you can move freely within the quarantine with those articles. If you're going to other adjacent quarantine counties, you can move freely outside of the quarantine area in non-quarantine counties. You can move regulated articles from a non-quarantine area into a quarantine area, but once you move it into a quarantine area, it is then regulated. The yellow means caution, so you can transit through a quarantine. So if you start in a non-quarantine area and are ending up at your destination in another non-quarantine area, you can travel through it. You just can't do overnights or anything like that, but you can, stop to refuel or have lunch and things like that. It just means caution. And then, like I mentioned, you can move freely in those quarantine areas or outside of them. We do have, so just remember, the quarantine areas will always be notified on our Interact map. If you ever have questions on that, please just reach out and we'll help you out with whatever you're trying to do. And we do have compliance agreements. So if there's if you do run a business that needs to move a regulated article, we can help you outline a process that ensures that you're not potentially actually spreading emerald ash borer to new locations and make sure we can facilitate your business still operating. So if you have specific needs with that, I'll have Danielle's contact information here in a second that you can write down, or just contact me and I'll get you in touch with her. And so the types of compliance agreements we have, it's, you can chip or grind mulch into, where that wood is ground up into, less than 1 inch by 1 inch in 2 dimensions. You can debark, compost. For firewood, most people do heat treatment. So we have a number of heat treatment certified firewood dealers throughout the state. And there's a couple other options there as well for lumber and whatnot. So just to go over again, definition of firewood, that's wood cut to lengths less than 4 feet long, whether it's split or not, whether it's for commercial or private use, and it's all hardwood species. So if you have a maple tree or something like that you want to move, if you can keep it in 4 foot lengths or longer, you're not going to be impacted by those regulations. And just to reiterate, firewood cannot enter from Canada or other states. It cannot leave the emerald ash borer quarantine, or we do have a spongy moth quarantine in Lake and Cook counties in far northeastern Minnesota as well. Firewood can move around inside of the pest quarantine. It can move around outside of the pest quarantine, and it can move anywhere in the state if you have MDA certified firewood. And so you know it's certified by that shield you'll see on the label. Oftentimes you'll see that type of wood available at gas stations and box stores and whatnot. And that is free to move anywhere throughout the state and into places like state parks and whatnot because it's certified free of pests due to the heat treatment process that it goes through. And so here's Danielle's contact information. If you have questions for your business about the quarantine, please reach out if you have any questions or comments. Once again, and you can always reach out to me as well and I can get you in touch with her. But we just really want to drive that point home with firewood. Just because you can't see any physical insect activity on the outside of a piece of ash, you peel off that bark, there's the insect gallery, but you still don't see anything. Well, you dig in and you have that emerald ash borer larva in its pupal chamber just waiting to pupate and emerge at a new location. So it is pretty concealed. And just because you don't see anything on the outside of a tree that lets you know it's infested, it still could be. So that's why we really harp on not moving firewood long distance. Buy it where you're going to burn it. And you'll see more of these campaigns on billboards and other ads throughout the state once we get towards Memorial Day. All right, so now I'm going to touch on management. So there's a few options for dealing with emerald ash borer. Just to, our best management practices. So if you can avoid it, try not to do any work on ash trees during the summer months. So when those beetles are actively flying around and laying their eggs on trees, you want to avoid doing work on ash during that time if you can at all. This is for a couple of reasons. A lot of times emerald ash borer will reinfest the same tree or a tree right next to it. If you're actively removing a tree in the summertime when those beetles are up in the canopy, you're actually pushing them out faster to new locations than if you were to leave that tree until the fall and let those insects lay their eggs on that tree and then remove it then. Also, if you have to move the material, the brush and branches and whatnot to a new location that you're moving, you could potentially having adult beetles emerge from that load of wood as you move it to a new location. So, if at all possible, don't work on ash trees during that active period. But if you do, if you can leave that wood on site or chip it before you move it to try to kill the majority of it, or at the very least cover your load as you move it to whatever site it's going to be processed at. To try to reduce the incidental spread and moving it faster than it would by natural flight. So if at all possible, do that work in the winter months, the fall, winter, and early spring. Best time when those beetles are dormant, they're underneath the bark, and you can destroy that material before it gets to the next flight season. So try to do it then. Obviously, storms and things like that happen. So just try to work with caution and do what you can. And once an area becomes really heavily infested, it may become pertinent to just deal with the hazardous trees, and you won't be able to follow that schedule as much. But while you can, try to avoid doing that work on ash trees in the summer months. All right, so when it comes to dealing with emerald ash borer, kind of at a landscape level in your yard and your community, you really only have two options. It's removals or insecticide treatments. So you can start with removals before emerald ash borer is known to be there. So if you're a community and you have a large number of ash trees that you have to manage, it would be good to start reducing the amount of ash you have on your properties, targeting poor quality trees, poorly sited trees, just starting to reduce that. Once emerald ash borer is found, targeting trees that show that woodpecker damage. So that's a good way to prioritize things, because the trees that show that woodpecker damage are going to have more higher levels of emerald ash borer in the tree, as opposed to a tree next to it that doesn't have that woodpecker damage. And obviously you got to deal with dead and hazardous trees as they come up and in their areas where they might damage property. Then with insecticide treatments, they're both preventative and therapeutic. So they are highly effective treatments as long as they're applied properly on a healthy enough tree. So you can start treating an ash tree before emerald ash borer arrives, if you don't want to risk any potential damage to the tree, and you can still treat it after that tree is lightly infested as well. It'll stop the infestation where it's at. The general rule of thumb is that no more than 30% canopy decline, that tree is still a good candidate for treatment. Once it's past that point, that tree tends not to be healthy enough, and it's already too much damage. It doesn't look as good once it's more than 30% dead, and one can't properly distribute the insecticide to fully protect the tree. So the general rule of thumb for treatments, if you want to ensure that your tree's not going to get impacted by EAB, once you're within about 10 miles of a known infestation, that's a good time to begin doing treatments. And unfortunately, it's not a once and done thing, and it has to be reapplied, depending on the chemical every year, every couple of years. And so other things you want to think about when you're deciding whether to do removal or treatment. How close is emerald ash borer known to be? Like I just mentioned, if you're within 10 miles of a known infestation, it might be a good time to start thinking about treatment. How healthy is the tree to begin with? How large is it? So is it a smaller tree? Is it something that's easy to cut down and get another type of tree growing and up to that same size to start giving out benefits again? And how many trees do you have to deal with? All those factors come into play when making the decision on whether treating a tree is worth it. And how many trees, if you're a city trying to manage this, you may want to treat a number of trees for a set amount of time just to slow the rate at which trees die on public property so that you don't have so many dead trees in a short amount of time that you can't deal with all the hazardous trees. So you may not decide to treat the tree for the life of the tree, but you can do it for a set amount of time to kind of slow the rate at which trees die in an area. So it is a very effective management tool in that sense as well. An individual tree in a person's property, you could treat that tree if you have a large mature tree that gives you lots of shade, and it would take 40 years to get a tree back to that size at that location. You could treat that tree for the next 25 years before you ever reach what that initial removal expense would be. So in some cases, it really makes economic sense to treat that tree instead of having it removed. So really, you got to be paying attention. You got to be proactive. And if you're a community, you should be coming up with a management plan. It's really important to have an inventory. Without an ash inventory, you don't know what your resource is, and you won't know how to manage it properly. So if you're a community that's beginning to think about ash tree management and emerald ash borer management, please feel free to reach out. There have been grant programs that have been coming up through the DNR Community Forestry. There will likely be another round of community forest grants coming out pretty soon that you'd be able to apply for that can help you with funds for coming up with a management plan and ash inventory or doing removal and replacements. So I encourage you to look for those grant opportunities as they come up. And mentioning with the insecticide treatments, there's a few different chemical options that are available. We have a nice homeowner's guide to insecticide selection. They're systemic. So the ones that most professional tree care companies use is typically with the active chemical emamectin benzoate. It's a very effective treatment. It's guaranteed for 2 years before it needs to be reapplied again. And so that's applied via a trunk injection method. It is a restricted use pesticide, so you need to be a licensed pesticide applicator to apply it. So we really encourage people with large mature trees. So as you get over that 15 inches in diameter at breast height, once you get into those really large trees, we encourage people to have them professionally done. So you know that you have a professional diagnosing whether that tree is healthy enough for it and having it applied properly. A lot of the chemicals the average homeowner can buy themselves are applied via a soil drench method. A lot of times it's the chemical imidacloprid or dinotefuran. Those treatments are good for a year and need to be reapplied, but you got to really make sure you check the label and make sure that they're effective for a tree of your size. So once you get into those larger trees, some of the chemicals available to the average homeowner aren't rated for really large trees. So make sure you check that if you plan on doing it yourself. But the chemicals are very effective as long as the tree is healthy enough and they're applied properly. They are very effective for protecting ash trees. So it is a good option. And just remember, they do need to be repeated. And so management priorities, they're going to shift as you move from an uninfested area into a heavily infested area. So kind of the priorities, just to reiterate this, if you're in an uninfested area, the most important thing is early detection. So looking for the presence of emerald ash borer, reporting infestations, and then if you're community planning and making sure you have that inventory and coming up with a management plan for when it does arrive and beginning to do things on the front end so it's not as much work for when it does arrive. And really diversifying your community forests, because this isn't the last forest pest that's going to come through and cause damage. We need to learn these lessons where we need a diversity of species so you don't have whole areas being with trees taken out, entire blocks and whatnot, losing all their shade in a short amount of time. Once it's found, treating high value trees, removing trees in a timely fashion to try to limit the amount of hazardous trees out there that could fall and hurt people or damage property. And then once you're heavily infested and that beetle pressure is really high, just trying to minimize wood movement out of the area and utilize it in whatever way you can, whether it's for firewood in your backyard or using for mulch in city plantings and things like that. Lastly, reporting. So now that you know what to look for and how to identify it, please let us know if you find new infestations around the state that we can follow up on. So really what we need from you, if you're reporting a new infestation, please take pictures. Pictures are worth 1,000 words. If you can take pictures of the specific damage that you're seeing, so the woodpecker damage as up close as possible, pictures of the insect larva or the beetle that you found, you can collect it and send it to us. You can report it to your local city forester through EdMap's reporting system, or often the easiest way is our MDA's report a pest. So we have an online form, we have that email or a voicemail. Just please be as detailed as possible, especially with the location. So we have ease of follow-up. So if you have a specific address or coordinates, and like I mentioned, please take pictures if at all possible, because we can really figure things out a lot faster if we have pictures. With that, I'd like to thank you for joining us, and I can open it up to any questions you might have. Here's our contact information. Be happy to answer any questions. If you think of them later, please feel free to reach out via email or phone call. And thanks again for attending. This was recorded, and I'll try to get that recording link up on our website within the next day. Any questions? So does the DNR actively monitor? So it's the Department of Agriculture that actually does the monitoring. We actually have grant funds right now, and this is why we've been having a lot more detections. We're out there actively surveying during the wintertime. We're basically going to communities along major transportation corridors and communities that are kind of on the leading edge of known infestation areas. So we're out there actively looking. And we've already surveyed probably 80 new communities this winter. So we're really putting a lot of effort in there, and we did over 115 communities last winter. And yes, it's the Minnesota Department of Agriculture that typically follows up on citizen reports as well. So a question from Josh for Kanabec County SWCD. Will SWCDs be able to apply for grants to assist landowners with DAB? That will depend on the DNR community forestry grants and how they structure them. And it tends to be a little bit different each round. But there was one grant, the relief grant last fall, that came out that allowed or governmental units to assist landowners with emerald ash borer removals, but typically it's been funds for doing work on public property. So yeah, that is an issue, especially for folks on limited income budgets that can't afford to do tree removals. We still don't have great answers for that. Next question is, what is the best resource for getting advice on which insecticides to use? So our homeowner guides to insecticide options is I would go through that. But the industry standard, as far as tree care professionals, they mostly use the chemical emamectin benzoate for the large mature trees that are applied via that trunk injection method. That has the most research on it, and it seems to be the most highly effective for large mature trees. On average, the cost of that too is, it can vary depending where you are in the state and how many people provide that service, or if you're doing it in-house, if you invest in the equipment. But on average, for an average homeowner, it's like about $10 a diameter inch. So if it's a 15-inch diameter tree, about $150 every 2 years to protect it. If you're if you invest in the equipment and you're managing a large number of trees, some communities that do the treatments in-house, get that cost down to below $5 a diameter inch. All right. Do we have any further questions? All right. Well, thanks, everybody. If you think of any questions after we end this, please feel free to just shoot me an email. If you want to send me an email, let me know exactly what you'd like copies of. I can certainly get you some of these slides if you'd like them. Thanks, everybody.